The Origin of the Species was published in 1859. Let me tell you a little bit through this video clip of Charles Darwin and how it happened. So, watch
born
this.
in the mind of a British naturalist. His name was Charles Darwin. In 1831, Darwin, then 22 years old, set sail on a 5-year survey expedition for the British Empire. He journeyed from England on the HMS Beagle, traveling around the southern tip of South America, then north toward a chain of volcanic islands in the Pacific called the Galapagos. On this desolate archipelago, 600 miles off the western coast of Ecuador, Charles Darwin encountered an extraordinary array of birds, reptiles, and mammals, the likes of which he had never seen before. For more than a month, Darwin studied plant and animal life, took extensive notes, and collected specimens. Then he left, never to return. 25 years passed as he developed a theory about how the diverse forms of life on Earth had originated. In 1859, Darwin published a book titled On the Origin of Species. Its impact on science and ultimately all of Western culture was dramatic. Darwin argued that all life was the product of purely undirected natural forces, time, chance, and a process he called natural selection.
All right, so that gives you an idea of how Darwin came up with this theory. He wasn't the first one that said various life forms descended from others, but he seemed to come up with a plausible mechanism in which it could happen. And that's why he's credited with being the father of modern evolutionary theory. Well, there are charts that we see, our students see them in high school. It's shown in college, charts like this that represent the evolutionary tree that starts very simple at the bottom and becomes more and more complex as it progresses, with man being on the very top of the evolutionary tree. And you will see charts like this. The problem is, we'll get to it later, what we're finding in the fossil record is that you have to invert that tree. There are actually many more life forms at the base of the tree, and the reality is it's getting narrower as time progresses, as more and more organisms become extinct. So Darwin's tree really contradicts totally what the fossil record has found. But his tree began very narrow, very simple organisms, and back in Darwin's day, they were not able to look at all these simple-celled organisms very closely. We now have electron microscopes that can look very closely at these organisms. And what he thought was very simple organisms, we have found to be extremely complex, which goes totally against evolutionary theory. The theory was that these must be very, very simple organisms, that life out of some primordial ooze emerged. These very simple organisms became very, very complex, and what they're finding is within the cell of every human being, of every living thing, are very complex biological machines that defy evolution, that go against the theory of evolution. That's not taught to our kids in school. This is contrary to what Darwin thought and what evolutionary theory really demands, these complex biological machines in what was thought to be very simple organisms. But Darwin proposed that it began very simple and became more and more complex. There's other charts you might see, one like this, that speaks of the origin and development of man, right? That we have descended from chimps and apes, and eventually over millions of years, a human came about through evolution. And as I looked at that chart, I thought, maybe there is something to that, because I saw something very familiar in this chart. I looked at it and I thought, there is something, and I just began to magnify that chart, because as I looked, especially those two in the middle, I thought there's something really familiar. Maybe there's something behind this evolutionary theory, and I kept magnifying it, and there it was. There. I saw that maybe there's something behind this. Well, we know there's not, right? At least I don't believe there is. I believe God created man and woman, created them in his image. And even though you might see charts like this, you need to know those charts are not based on scientific findings that have been made. They're artist conceptions. They believe this must have occurred like this, and they're sincere about it. But But they haven't found the missing links between all of those progressions that have to happen over billions of years. The missing links are still there. We would perhaps think that they have found missing links, but there's not one that has been found. There are scientists who will say today that there are no confirmed transitional forms between kinds of animals. What do we mean by a transitional form? Let's take a reptile who transitions into a bird, and that's what they believe ultimately happened in evolution. You would think that in the fossil record, over billions of years, you would find millions of fossils of this reptile slowly changing into a bird. Now, this happened not only with reptiles to birds, but every human organism, every living organism had this kind of transition happening between the organism that resulted and the one that it was descended from. There should be millions of these fossils of transitional organisms, not fully developed wings. And that's what evolutionists will point to today. For example, between a human and an ape. Look at the similarity. That ape is a transitional form. No, that's a fully developed organism. If you take a reptile to a bird, there should be millions of years of fossils of this wings developing in this reptile. That would have taken millions of years. It would have taken an amazing amount of genetic information to be added to that biological organism for it to develop wings. There has not been any fossil evidence found that are confirmed transitional forms, wings developing that are not fully developed. There are organisms like the ape that looks a lot like man. That's called homology. Similar biological organisms. But as many scientists will tell you, similarity does not speak to origin. Just because an ape is similar to man doesn't demand that they originated from one another, that we descended from an ape. It doesn't demand that at all. It just means they're similar. And what I would say, it points to a designer who used similarities in the biological system. That's how he designed it. It doesn't demand descent, as evolutionists will cry. There really are two types of evolution. Here they are, microevolution. And I've used this term. I agree with this term. I rather would use the word adaptation than microevolution. It's the adaptation or variation of organisms within a kind of organism through genetic potential and or natural selection. Another word that is used in biological terms is a phyla. Within a phyla, a family of animals, there is variation. We see that with birds. There's on the top there some birds with different beaks. There's variation. We're going to look at this in just a minute in a video of how in bird populations there are variations, for example, in the length and thickness of the bird's beak. I believe God placed that into the genetic code of the very first animals he created. When we see dogs, I believe in the first dogs that God created, there's a lot of variations that were there, except for the poodle. That wasn't there originally, but everything else was there. But there's a lot of variation that God placed into the genetic code. We see that in our human population, that there's a lot of variation among humans around the world. If you go around the world, you will see a ton of variation. And I believe, as do many scientists, that God placed in Adam and Eve the genetic potential for all the variations that we see in the human population today around the earth. He did that. That was his design. And I mentioned briefly last week that scientists have determined that all of humanity, by sampling various DNA populations of people around the world, they've brought all the data together, and they have determined that all of humanity has descended from one human mother, that we have all descended from one human mother. Now, they will say that human mother was a result of evolution leading up to this human mother that gave birth to all the people that live on the earth today. And I would say no, it supports the story of Adam and Eve, that God created Eve, and we have all descended from Eve and from Adam. But there was amazing diversity placed into the genes, the DNA of Adam and Eve. And that led to ultimately all the diversity that we see in our planet today. There's another type of evolution that I do not agree with, and that's called macroevolution. It's the theory that all forms of plant and animal life are descended from earlier and simpler forms of life with no need for a creator. That's macroevolution. That's what I do not hold to, and certainly many other scientists do not hold to.